I'm going to start today's conversation off with a curveball question, and I want to see how you answer it.
Okay.
Explain the thyroid to me, and its function and why it's important, like I was a 5-year-old. If you can, you can.
Yeah, okay. I love this question. Um, so again, with all of my explanations, I like to, I mean, my training and my background is in functional nutrition and functional medicine. So everything I explain is going to be sort of through that lens. So the thyroid is a butterfly-shaped gland. It sits like right here, in close to your voice box, and it produces hormones that bind to thyroid, like bind to receptors in your body and basically help to control metabolism. Weight is heavily influenced and controlled by thyroid function. We have body temperature also being influenced and controlled by the thyroid. A lot of like just physiological processes related to metabolism are controlled by the thyroid.
Mhm.
So again, we have thyroid hormones T4 and T3, and then there's a popular, well, popular. It's the most common biomarker that is typically measured by doctors. It's TSH, the thyroid stimulating hormone. And this is actually released from your pituitary gland, and it sends signals to your thyroid to produce thyroid hormone. So thyroid hormone T4 is first produced. This is the thyroid hormone that is the least biologically active.
Mm,
And then it gets converted to T3, which is more
got it.
biologically active. And so there's a couple nutrients that play a really big role in that conversion. Protein is one of them, iron is one of them, selenium, iodine. That's why those two nutrients in particular are discussed often when it comes to or as it relates to thyroid health. And then these hormones again are sort of dispersed throughout our body and play a really big role in weight, metabolism, body temperature, can even control hair growth, energy levels, things like that. Um, and then when it comes to like further testing with the thyroid, we often look at antibodies as well. So
Mm.
like TPO, thyroglobulin, these are antibodies that are produced in response to thyroid inflammation. Not every practitioner looks at them, but they're really, really important because you could have a normal TSH and normal thyroid hormones, but your thyroid antibodies could be elevated, which could be the start of something like Hashimoto's, which is an autoimmune disease, or it definitely indicates there's some sort of thyroid inflammation, which you want to get on top of addressing.
I think I had that in a previous physical. Is it like ANA? Is that what it's read as? ANA, or is that a
No.
different one?
ANA is a different one. That's a really common
Oh.
antibody that's used to assess overall autoimmune status. But there's
Mm,
specific antibodies. So TPO and thyroglobulin are the antibodies associated with the thyroid.
got it. Okay. So it's safe to say the thyroid has a lot of different impacts on our body, right?
Yes. Mhm.
Um, I'm curious as to what your thoughts are. Like, when can you tell just from hearing a symptom or two that someone is dealing with? That does your mind immediately go, oh, this is thyroid, or does it always kind of need to be a blood work situation? Like, are there easy tells, I guess is my question with thyroid dysfunction.
hmm Yeah, I will say too, like I by no means am I a thyroid specialist. This isn't something that I specialize in my practice. Like I know gut health or sex hormones and metabolism, but I know enough to speak about it. So I just wanted to preface with that. But yes, in practice, if someone is telling me, and I see this so often with women in their 40s, if they are having poor stress resilience, so they're feeling very overwhelmed by a lot of things going on in their life, they have an inability to lose weight. They're changing their diet, they're changing the way they move their body, they're changing the way that they manage their stress, but they're having a hard time losing weight. Those two things in combination with like brittle nails, brittle hair, or like weak hair, drying hair, split ends, fatigue, chronic fatigue is oftentimes a huge indicator of thyroid dysfunction. Anxiety can oftentimes be an indicator of thyroid dysfunction as well. So I would say those are some of the most common ones.
Got it. Where do you start when it comes to fixing this? Because it feels like there are a lot of foods, some surprising ones too, foods that can help. But is it always as easy as fixing the diet, or do you sometimes have to go a little further? I know sometimes when you prescribe treatment plans, it's not just food, but it's also things like probiotics. Does the thyroid need special attention, would you say?
For sure. Yeah. If I'm running a thyroid lab or if something is coming back as being abnormal, it really depends on what it is. Like for example, if I'm seeing elevated antibodies and maybe low hormones, then I will take somebody off gluten right away. That's a
Hmm.
really big thing. There's a lot of research on how gluten can contribute to thyroid dysfunction, particularly in the way that it can lead to intestinal hyperpermeability. There's a lot of thought and a lot of discussion in the functional medicine world on how gluten in particular can contribute to, again, intestinal hyperpermeability or what's better known as leaky gut. And again, in the functional medicine world, there's a lot of talk on how that is the foundation for all autoimmune conditions, if not most of them, maybe not all of them, but most of them. And so the biggest thing, and I've had the biggest or the most success with taking my clients off gluten and seeing a big improvement in thyroid function. Looking at gut health, again, if I'm running labs and their thyroid markers are coming back as being abnormal, then I definitely want to do a deeper dive into their gut health and see if they do have the positive leaky gut markers like high zonulin, or if they have a low secretory IgA, which is the marker for immune function in our gut. We have to keep in mind about 80% of our immune system resides within our gut. So looking at those markers, making sure we're sealing up the gut lining, we're strengthening that mucosal barrier to help
Hmm.
prevent any further damage to the thyroid. I might also recommend like some selenium. I don't always recommend iodine right away because there's a lot of mixed research on iodine use, like supplementation when it comes to thyroid dysfunction. Looking deeper at heavy metals too. Heavy metal toxicity can also contribute to Hashimoto's or poor thyroid function. So those are some of the deeper dives that I like to do.
The gluten piece is interesting because I think that's something a lot of people notice the moment they cut it out, even if they're not having thyroid issues, just general inflammation, or I guess you could say bloating tends to subside. That bloating is has something to do with thyroid, or is that just a byproduct of gluten in the gut, or how are those two things correlated?
Yeah, it could be both. Yeah, the
Yeah.
thyroid, it does impact all the things I had mentioned, but it also does play a role in things like fertility and gut health. So
Hmm.
it definitely it could slow motility, which could lead to constipation, which can contribute to bloating.
I'm
So
trying. Yeah, I'm trying to find the visual kind of appearance based things that you might notice somebody with thyroid dysfunction might have. I'm thinking also based off of where the thyroid is located. It feels like oftentimes when you're sick with some sort of upper respiratory issues, you feel these glands that are kind of inflamed. Is that also thyroid related, kind of up in this area here, or not?
No,
That not
not
quite.
necessarily. Yeah, that's going to be more like those are your like lymph nodes or your
Lymph nodes. Yeah.
tonsils. But
Okay.
if you're into the spiritual th side of things, there's a lot of talk on the thyroid being associated with the throat chakra. So if
Okay.
there's a trauma that could be associated with, or if somebody doesn't feel comfortable or powerful in their voice, or they are not super clear in their communication, that could be related to, there's a connection, there's a link between communication, the throat chakra, and the thyroid.
Yes, I do believe in that stuff, so I think there's something to that. Very interesting because
Yeah.
it kind of ties back to our conversation last week about trauma and stress and how those things can negatively impact your immune system. So that's really cool.
Yeah.
And think of the things we've already spoken about in terms of what negatively impacts the thyroid and what positively impacts it. The biggest things I've kind of ticked off the list so far are possibly gluten, or maybe definitely gluten.
Yeah.
You talked about heavy metals as well. Are
Mhm.
there things that we're maybe not eating like putting into our mouths, but maybe that we're exposed to that could also
Mhm.
negatively or positively impact the thyroid. Maybe things like going outside or some of these more like exogenous ways that we take in nutrients. What can you think of there?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think just generally, like as I had mentioned, with testing, I like to look at heavy metals and, all of the chemicals and pesticides. I know I bring this up a lot, but it's so valid.
Yeah.
We have so much exposure to these toxic chemicals in our environments, and they definitely can negatively impact the thyroid. I actually have a colleague who had thyroid cancer, and now she
Mm,
specializes in this. She overcame it, and
mm,
she specializes in this, and she talks about the heavy metals a lot when it comes to Hashimoto's in particular, which is the autoimmune piece of the thyroid. And in her words, she says your thyroid is not inflamed for no reason. You don't have these antibodies for no reason. It's because you're exposed to something that is inflaming your thyroid. And again, there's a lot of talk and like research on heavy metals. And so, of course, it's not always easy, but trying to get organic foods,
mm,
trying to drink filtered water, scanning and vetting your personal care products, making sure they don't have fragrance or parabens, phthalates, some of these other toxic chemicals that are liberally found within our personal care products.
mm.
Making sure,
Also, things like shampoo and skincare things can
yeah,
also kind of negatively impact. Okay, that's interesting.
yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know, like, the direct or exact mechanism of action, but we know that they have the potential to inflame the thyroid.
Hmm. Yeah. Wow. Well, that's interesting. I always felt like I started hearing the word thyroid pop up a lot more when it came to autoimmune disorders.
Hmm.
And I don't know, maybe your colleague does. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the correlation between just the introduction of a lot more heavy metals and a lot of more phthalates and all of these other things that have kind of been introduced into our environment over the past, we'll call it 50 years.
Hmm.
Um, is it safe to say there is a correlation with the incidence of this stuff? Because I don't know how prominent thyroid cancer was before this, right? It feels like it's kind
Yeah.
of a newer age thing. Is
Mhm.
that right or accurate?
I haven't seen the data to say with
Yeah.
full confidence, but I assume just based on what I know, there's been an increase in a lot of different chronic diseases over the past 50 or so years,
Mm,
with the advent of using more chemicals and preservatives, and again, the liberal use of things like pesticides, and there's the issue with runoff into our water supply and pharmaceuticals. So some people argue, okay, we're just getting better at testing for these things and discovering them with our technology. But I think there's, definitely a connection between, all chronic disease, the increase of the chronic disease prevalence, and the use of, more and more chemicals in our uh, environment.
it seems more and more like the testing piece is becoming the reason for figuring out a lot of ailments. I think back in my theory is that back in the day, not back in the day, but 40, 50 years ago, when we said somebody died of natural causes, that
Hmm.
always kind of struck me as, but what was the natural cause? And now I think we
Yeah.
have more direct answers for what those natural causes could be, whether it is some sort of autoimmune thing or just general dysfunction or some sort of very niche cancer that might just kill somebody at age 80 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know if there are, because I think a lot of my readers and a lot of people who will listen to this newsletter inevitably might not live in New York like myself or Florida like yourself.
Hmm.
I wonder what parts of, in your opinion, the United States or even the world might be
Hmm.
less prone to thyroid issues, whether it's based on their diet or just the climate they live in.
Mm.
I'm wondering if maybe that's why you made the move down to Florida. Are there certain environmental conditions in which like that optimize for thyroid health is, or is it just like a better crops, better weather kind of scenario?
Yeah, I mean, definitely having access to sunlight is
Mm,
helpful for a lot of different things. Vitamin D plays a really big role in the conversion of these thyroid hormones as well. So we need to
mm,
make sure we're getting adequate vitamin D. A lot of people are so afraid of the sun, but like
yeah.
strategically getting sun exposure is actually so beneficial for your health. I'm not saying go bake in the sun for, 10 hours every day or whatever, but again, strategic sun exposure can be really, really helpful for resetting your circadian rhythm, helping with vitamin D production, which is involved in immune regulation and again, thyroid health. So the sun definitely plays a big role. I will say New York City, just by design, is probably one of the most toxic places to
Toxic.
live.
Yeah, I knew
Sorry
that
to
was going to
say
be the word you said.
that.
Yeah.
It's a great city. You have a lot available and accessible to you there, but it can be really toxic with the air quality, with the stress alone of living in New York, the rush, the go,
Right.
go, go. The water supply is not great. I remember when I was living there, I had a Berkey water filter, and I don't know if you're familiar with that, but they use like a specific carbon technology to filter their water, and they're one of the best, or I have options that I like better now, but back then they were supposed to be one of like the best water filters in the country. And I remember like filling it up with my tap water from New York. After like a month, the filters became so clogged. I was
Hmm.
buying filters so frequently. It was so bad, and so annoying. I know in the 80s, the New York was supposed to have like the cleanest and the best water of any big city, but I just like don't believe in that, to be
It's
honest.
starting to, I've also been a little skeptical of it
Yeah,
recently.
yeah.
With water, where does that fall on the hierarchy of thyroid importance, above food, below food, kind of all on the same
Mm.
spectrum?
Water is so, I took a whole continuing education class on water, and there's so much to say about it. Our water supply is so toxic. I do not recommend anyone drink tap water. My sister, she lives in Cleveland, and she like only drinks tap water, and it irks me. It
Mhm.
makes me so mad because
Yeah,
it truly is. There's pharmaceutical remnants. They have found birth control remnants in tap water. There's pesticides. There's so many chemicals, unfortunately, in our water supply. And water is supposed to be, at its core, clean and full of nutrients, like full of
right.
up to 80 different trace minerals. So in terms of the thyroid, I would say, yeah, it's probably on the same playing field as food.
Food, right.
Yeah. Quality.
The nutrients in water, I think, is something that I've just recently started to learn about in doing my due diligence about what is good, what isn't good. I guess I would say good and bad, but really what isn't good about tap water. The first thing that kind of brought my attention to it was the amount of fluoride in there. And then the more I looked into it, it's like, well, that was really just for kids. And even for the kids, like there's only a certain amount of fluoride they need that they can probably get from, trace amounts in their toothpaste. And then once their teeth are all grown in, like the rest of us don't really need that fluoride. So I've been looking into water. I don't know, this might be a little bit of a side tangent, but I would maybe also like to hear your thoughts since you took a whole course on it, as to whether or not this affects thyroid and hormone health. I see a lot of filters on water, some that keep certain nutrients in, and then you've got things like reverse osmosis, which kind of take a
Yeah.
lot of nutrients out. Is
Yeah.
one of those better than the other in your opinion, in terms of like its impact on hormone health?
Yeah, the best water that we can drink is natural spring water.
Hmm. Yeah.
Of course, not everybody has access to natural spring water, but when water is free flowing, as it is theoretically from a spring, and it's in its most natural, purest state. It's full of oxygen, it's full of nutrients, it's full of life, literally, and it's really, really hydrating at the cellular level. Again, not everybody has access to that. I certainly don't here in Miami, so I'm not drinking natural free-flowing spring water every day, but that is the gold standard. I am a fan of reverse osmosis water because it does remove, I mean, there's pros and cons, right? It removes everything, which is great. It's removing all the shit, it's removing all the pesticides, all the toxins, but you do
Yeah.
have to remineralize.
Yes.
I use Element. Sometimes I don't know if you're familiar with Element. That's one of my favorite electrolytes.
Yeah.
A lot of people complain about the natural flavors, and I do get that. But I'm a huge fan of the high sodium content. One of the best electrolytes actually is one from Quicksilver. They have something called isotonic. They have hypertonic and isotonic. I'm blanking on the full name, but they have these electrolytes that they extract from a phytoplankton bloom that is like miles and miles below the ocean surface. So it's really, really high quality.
Wow.
And there's dozens and dozens of trace minerals in there. So that would be a really good one to remineralize with, although it is expensive. So
Yeah.
that's what I would recommend. If we really wanted to get into it, there's some research on like spiralized water. I'm not sure if you've heard of that. It's like it's a whole thing. I
Yeah, it sounds very complex.
yeah.
Maybe we have a water episode down the, or a
Yeah.
hydration episode down the pipeline that can come from that. That sounds really cool, though. Going back to, and by the way, we do keep a lot of element in the cabinets here. I try to watch sodium intake, but 'cause I can't do a full packet all at once. I'll usually do maybe half a pack because I
Mhm.
think 500 milligrams is like, all right, that'll do for now, and then I'll have the rest later. Or on a day like today, where in an hour or two, when the sun starts to go down, I'll go on a longer run. I know I'm going to sweat out a lot of it. Then I'll probably have a full packet. But going back to thyroid health, I was curious, and I've asked this question kind of as we've gotten into all of the um, different types of hormones. What would you do outside of the whole food realm to like what supplements would you go to for thyroid health? Assuming somebody might not have access to some of the foods or the good mineral water to regulate things from a hormone standpoint.
Yeah. It's hard to say without testing because
Mm,
ideally somebody is eating a whole foods diet that is
right.
keeping all of their biology and their physiology intact, so to speak. So we don't necessarily want to give any supplements without doing further testing to see if there is true thyroid dysfunction. If we do that and there is true thyroid dysfunction, specifically if there's hypothyroidism, which is where our TSH tends to be elevated and our thyroid hormones tend to be low. And that's just basically having low thyroid function, which is more common than hyperthyroidism. Then I might recommend right away doing maybe adding some selenium.
Mm,
200 micrograms every day as a supplement could be really helpful. Making sure to eat plenty of protein. I know that's not a supplement, but it's really
sure.
important.
It could be.
Yeah,
Powder.
yeah, yeah. Amino acids could be really good. I don't know if you're familiar with the brand Body Health. The doctor who started that brand, he does research on amino acids actually. I think it's David,
Okay.
is it David Minkoff?
Mm,
He wrote a whole book on like amino acids and protein, and that brand is really good. I might recommend something like L-glutamine or
yeah.
immunoglobulins, like bovine immunoglobulins, just to cover our bases in case there is any leaky gut. Colostrum can also be good, but I know a lot of people are sensitive to dairy. Um, what else? Vitamin D can be helpful. Iron is oftentimes helpful too. But again, it just depends on what we're seeing in the lab, but like, or in the labs. But at baseline, I would say selenium, and probably some L-glutamine.
Selenium's come up a lot. That's a nutrient I've started to do a little bit more digging on myself,
Mhm.
just because it seems like it has a really net positive effect on a lot of hormones, not just thyroid, but all of them. For those of you guys listening who are like, where do I get selenium? Correct me if I'm wrong here, but Brazil nuts and walnuts are some pretty
Yeah,
good sources I've been leaning on.
yeah,
My supermarket's out of Brazil nuts lately, and I'm just like, I need them to get those back because I would just have, I think it was like one or two a day
yeah.
gets you your daily
All you
dosage of
need.
selenium. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I was like, great. I would just have one in the morning with breakfast or two with breakfast. It was great.
Great.
Um, your Zoom timer, I assume, hasn't popped up yet, right? So you still have at least a few more minutes here. I
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we got enough, we got more than enough time. I'd be curious to know, this is also something I've kind of kept as a common thread during these conversations. What other biomarkers might good thyroid function have an impact on aside from just the hormones? Or I mean, maybe it is all the hormones, but what good effects could a positive thyroid test have on other biomarkers, and what negative ones? Like, what other co-occurring things would you see on both good and bad tests?
Yeah. Um, Generally, just thinking about the synergy of it all. Again, like
Yeah,
there's a lot of nutrients that
yeah.
play a really big role in thyroid function. So if you have like hypothyroidism, oftentimes concurrently I'll see low ferritin or low iron,
Mm,
or low vitamin D. Vitamin D plays a
right,
really big role in so many different things. Maybe there's low protein. I like to see protein when we're looking at the metabolic panel at least seven.
mm,
Yeah, so those would be a couple ones that can positively influence thyroid function, or if you have like negative or bad thyroid labs or low thyroid, we probably will see some um, abnormalities with those biomarkers too. Um,
right.
Gut health, like I said, plays a really big role. Yeah, if we have good thyroid markers, if we have sufficient, thyroid hormone, we have normal TSH, we have no antibodies or very little antibodies, then we're also going to see likely a lot of good biomarkers, not always, but some healthy biomarkers with metabolism too, metabolic markers. So cholesterol, liver enzymes, the liver and the thyroid have an intimate relationship too. What else? Yeah. Did I say cholesterol? Yeah.
Yeah, you did.
Some of
Yeah.
these metabolic markers we will see be normal or be within a good range when the thyroid looks good. Again, not always, but oftentimes yes, because there's a connection.
Two more questions for you because I just saw our timer pop up now. The liver and the thyroid having an intimate connection. I think that's something we should delve into a little bit.
Mhm.
Of course, I think we're moving away, thankfully, from this alcohol culture that has really dominated the past like 2 or 3 decades at least, if not more.
Mhm.
But I would want to know if maybe this is like a layup question for you. If somebody is a heavy, maybe not even a heavy, but just a regular alcohol consumer, I'd have to think that would have, if it has a bad effect on the liver, it also has a bad effect on the thyroid, or not necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, alcohol can negatively impact everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Literally everything. Yeah, I mean, cortisol, just going back to cortisol because that is typically when I'm doing testing in my practice when we're looking at cortisol on the Dutch test in
Yeah.
particular. Um,
Right.
Cortisol is metabolized in the liver, and that process is dependent on the thyroid.
Mm,
So, if somebody is drinking heavily, just thinking about this, like definitely there's an indirect or maybe a direct influence. If somebody is drinking heavily and frequently, um, yeah, they're likely going to have a little bit of liver inflammation depending on, how frequent and how much they're drinking and what they're drinking.
right.
Detoxification pathways might be burdened to some capacity. Most people do have poor detoxification capacity, or just because we are so exposed to so many chemicals and things. Um, so yeah, if that is the case and someone's liver is burdened from their alcohol consumption, we might see, yeah, poor outcomes with cortisol. Um, I'm trying to think of the direct. Now my brain is getting confused.
Well, the good news is you kind of answered my second
Okay.
question, which was going to be the direct, or not the direct, but the relationship between cortisol and thyroid. Because my brain started going back to our previous conversation about this circadian nature of the thyroid, or of cortisol rather, and I wondered if the thyroid kind of worked in synchronization with that cortisol.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah,
schedule?
yeah.
No. Okay.
For sure. Yeah. As I mentioned, the connection that I'm most familiar with is the thyroid influencing cortisol metabolism in the liver.
Hmm.
Now,
Got it.
alcohol also really negatively impacts the gut lining. So
Right.
it can be one of the biggest contributors to leaky gut, which we
Hmm.
know in the world of functional medicine, again, we know leaky gut or having like tears or bruises or a weak epithelial lining in our gut that can contribute to an immune reaction, specifically with the thyroid. So, alcohol can definitely indirectly impact the thyroid in that way. But we know overall it is a toxin. It has no place in a healthy diet, unfortunately. I know many people are sad to hear that, but it's true. Uh,
Sure.
so,
So, giving the quick bullet pointed recap of thyroid health, you can go back and correct me if I missed anything, but at the top of the list, we'd have to say, whole foods, healthy diet, balanced diet,
mhm,
possibly limiting gluten when you can is
yes.
probably takes precedent.
Mhm,
Filtering your water at every chance you get seems like to
yeah.
be the another level of importance.
Yeah.
Um, High protein when you can, sunlight, and eliminating, trying to eliminate, because it doesn't seem like we can fully eliminate them unless we move to Europe. Toxins in your environment.
Let's
Um,
all come to Europe.
exactly. Is there anything I missed? I think I listed off four. Any other thyroid pieces that people should take with them before we wrap up here?
I'm not sure if you mentioned eating plenty of protein.
Protein is up
Sunlight,
there, yeah.
sunlight in the morning, sunlight in the evening, like before the sun sets. Making sure to get plenty of iron-rich foods.
Give us a few iron-rich foods. I probably could, but you could probably rattle them off
Yeah.
faster.
Grass-fed beef is huge. Pumpkin seeds, spinach, beef liver, chicken liver. I always recommend those foods to people. I know they're not, a lot of people don't like the taste, but those can be really good for you. They're really high in iron. Um, yeah, certain legumes like lentils.
Yeah.
And you also want to make sure you're pairing your iron-rich foods with vitamin C-rich foods, like green bell peppers or strawberries or some fruit, because that helps with the absorption of iron.
That's my big takeaway from today. That was the one thing that I kind of actually was very surprised to hear. Well, surprised to hear a couple things on today's episode, but very much that. Okay, so pair the iron-rich foods with vitamin C-rich foods. That doesn't, I don't know. Maybe I'd have to just expand my palate a little bit. I'm thinking of the vitamin C-rich foods and the iron foods, and I'm like, would that taste good together? I don't know. Maybe I need to
Pair
explore it a
your
little.
steak, your grass-fed steak, with some like sautéed green bell peppers.
Oh, that could work. That could work. Okay. I don't know. For some reason, my mind always goes to fruit when I think vitamin C. So
Yeah, yeah.
peppers could be doable.
Mhm.
Great. Well, I think that's pretty much all we got. Is there anything we missed? Anything you want to remind everybody about thyroid health before we wrap up?
Um, I think I mean, the biggest thing is to get tested. If you are having a lot of unexplained weight gain or weight loss resistance, if you're noticing your hair is thinning or your nails seem brittle or you're really, really fatigued, you definitely want to get the full thyroid panel. If your doctor is just running TSH, it's not enough. Your
Mhm.
TSH could be normal, but your T3 could still be low, or you could have elevated antibodies, and that's the start of Hashimoto's. So
Right.
you need to make sure that if you have any of those symptoms, you need to find a practitioner who's willing to run the full panel.
Right. Yeah. I think that's definitely also been a resounding theme of these conversations too, is going the extra mile with the
Mhm,
testing.
mhm.
Yeah, we'll
It can
keep
be
finding time.
life-changing.
Yeah, I was say I think we keep finding time and time again that it's hard to get tested for all these things, and a lot of doctors won't. So,
Mhm.
well, thank you. This was great. Let's bookmark gut health for next week because I think
Okay.
there's a lot to dive into on that.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds great.
Awesome.